A letter arrives, but only after death. Welcome to Grey Wishper. I'm your host, Silas Drex. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Your comments bring this mystery alive. Now let's begin. It was a bitter February afternoon when I returned to Baker Street, my coat flecked with soot from a passing hansom cab, and my mind on nothing more mysterious than the warmth of the sitting-room fire. The fog hung low over London, the kind that seemed to cling to the very air you breathed, blurring the outlines of buildings and turning the gas lamps into dim, glowing orbs. I found Holmes standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the indistinct movement of figures along the street below. "You have news," I ventured, hanging my coat. Holmes' head inclined slightly. A client approaches. Judging from the rhythm of his gait, the weight upon his steps, and the unusually long pause before ascending our steps, yes, he has stopped to compose himself. I should say we are about to be consulted on a matter both personal and grave. As if on cue, a firm knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, spare gentleman of perhaps 50 years. His face was pale, and his eyes had that restless, haunted look I had seen in soldiers returning from battlefields. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes? I am Geoffrey Markham," the man began, his voice hoarse. "I apologize for calling unannounced, but I have been advised by a mutual acquaintance that you are the only man who can help me." Holmes gestured him toward the armchair. "Please sit. You will find that candor is the surest road to assistance here." Markham hesitated before speaking. 3 days ago, my elder brother, Charles, was buried in St. Jude's churchyard. He had been a man of some repute, an importer of fine silks, and his death, though sudden, was attributed to natural causes. Yesterday morning a letter arrived for me. It bore his handwriting. I leaned forward, thinking I had misheard. "From your brother?" "From my brother," Markham affirmed gravely. The postmark was the day after his funeral. Holmes took the letter from Markham's trembling hands. He examined it minutely without opening it. First the envelope, then the paper, holding it to the light and sniffing faintly at the corner. "The seal is genuine," he murmured, "and the handwriting, unquestionably by the same hand on this calling card in your breast pocket." Markham started. "How?" Holmes waved away the question. "Later. Pray, let us hear the contents." Markham unfolded the sheet. The paper crackled in the stillness of the room. "Geoffrey," he read aloud, "you must believe that what happened was no accident. There is a hand behind it, one close enough to strike again. Seek out the ledger in the false drawer of my desk. Trust no one, save the bearer of this letter." It was unsigned, but the writing is Charles's without a doubt. "Curious," Holmes said softly. "You have the desk, I presume?" "Yes, in my possession since his death. I examined it thoroughly. There is no false drawer, no ledger." Holmes's eyes lit briefly, as they did when he scented the faintest trace of an unusual quarry. "Mr. Markham, you have done well to come here. Your brother's words suggest not only that his death was unnatural, but that the killer's aim may not yet be satisfied. You are in peril." Markham's composure faltered. "But who?" "Charles had no enemies, none that I knew of." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Every man has enemies, Mr. Markham. The difference lies in whether they are patient enough to wait until the world believes the matter is closed." At that moment, the muffled clang of a bell from the street drew Holmes' attention. He stepped to the window, glanced down, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Watson, I believe the game has begun sooner than expected. There is a gentleman below loitering in the fog and studying our windows with too much interest for mere curiosity." Markham half rose in alarm. "Is he following me?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we shall determine before nightfall." If you'd like, I can now proceed with Section 2. Case Introduction, where Holmes will begin his analysis of the peculiarities of the letter and demonstrate his deductive skills in an unrelated observation before taking Markham to the scene. I confess I started when Holmes turned from the window with that peculiar brightness in his eye which signaled both certainty and amusement. He drew the curtain 2 inches with the point of his forefinger and regarded the fog as a general might his battlefield. "Our watcher has decided against the bell," he murmured. "He has taken 3 steps to the right, the better to command a view of the entryway without attracting the attention of those ascending. A timid sentinel, or one who fears to be recognized." "Do you know him?" I asked. "I know his kind," Holmes returned. "If you look closely—" "No, do not. The gaslight behind you will make you too distinct. If you look in reflection upon the glass, you will observe the brim of a low-crowned hat of a shape out of fashion for the West End, but common along the docks. The shoulders are square, the knees a trifle bent, and the right boot toes outward more than the left. That is the gait of a man who has worn a navy cutlass belt for years and now carries a revolver under his coat where the belt would have lain. We shall call him a seafaring man, retired, who has not wholly retired from the apprehension of danger." "You astonish me," said Markham, half rising. "If he is there for me—" "For you or for your news, which is nearly the same thing," Holmes replied. He let the curtain fall. "But he is not alone in this matter. The street has had 2 observers this half-hour, though only one was planted. The other was a chance passer who stopped to check an address and, finding it not his, went on." "How could you possibly know?" I began. Holmes reached without looking to the mantel-shelf and took down the small brass-bound lens he affected. "Because the passer was a clerk of some sort, inky cuffs, and he left on our sill the faintest smear of gum from the corner of an envelope he fumbled in the fog. The impressed number upon that gum, 17, is from the clerk's index label, and it has transferred. Mrs. Hudson will grumble when she polishes it." He turned from the window with the air of one laying aside a trifle. "Now, Mr. Markham, to business. We shall scrutinize your brother's letter again, and you shall indulge me in a few questions whose impertinence, I assure you, is only the handmaiden of accuracy." He seated Markham under the lamp and took the sheet between finger and thumb, careful not to further crease it. With the lens he read the watermark, then held the paper half an inch above the flame as one baits a moth. The heat raised a faint bloom of invisible writing that was not writing at all, but a discolored ripple where the nib had hesitated and pressed more heavily. "Turkey Mill," Holmes observed, "sold at Halfords and Strand. The chain-lying distances tell us as much. Your brother habitually wrote upon this stock?" "Yes. He kept a ream for personal correspondences." "The envelope?" "Also his," Markham said. "He was meticulous in every matter." Holmes sniffed the flap. His nostrils pinched, dried with blotting paper, not the breath. "There is a trace of orris, powder from a woman's dressing table. Faint but present. Your brother, a bachelor?" "Married, widowed these 5 years. "Then the powder," Holmes said, more to himself than to us, "is either a relic embedded in his blotter and transferred, or an intrusion." "You posted no letters this morning, Watson?" "None." "Then the odor comes to us with the message and is not of our house. The postmark next, Southwark Sorting Office, 9 of the clock, morning, the day after the funeral, as you stated. Observe the crisp ovals. The envelope saw but one stamping. Had a hand posted and withdrawn it to be reposted, we might expect doubling. We do not find it." Markham's fingers tightened upon the arm of his chair. "He tells me to trust the bearer of that letter, yet it came by post." "Just so," said Holmes, and his eyes smiled. "That phrase, 'the bearer of this letter,' belongs to a letter that lives in the pocket of a messenger, not the bag of a postman. We have then either a copy or a transposition of wording ill-fitted to the manner of delivery. Why would a man who feared for his life choose his words so carelessly? Either he did not write them in expectation of the post, he paused, tapping the paper with a long, sinewy finger, or the words were not meant for you once they reached the post. You mean, I said slowly, someone has altered the circumstances rather than the text. Excellent, Watson, Holmes cried. As neat a summation as any. There is nothing on this sheet save the hand and the matter. But the matter has been wrenched from its manner. It is a familiar trick to those who stage scenes rather than commit acts. He rose and walked to the fire, where he stood in profile, the keen line of his nose cutting the haze of lamplight. You say your brother died suddenly, and the verdict was natural causes. Who attended him last? His housekeeper, Mrs. Pike, found him collapsed in his study late in the afternoon. Markham answered. A physician, Dr. Elphinstone of Bermondsey, was called. He declared it an apoplexy. Doctor. Elphinstone, Holmes repeated flatly, as if trying the name upon his tongue. A safe, respectable, and unassailable apoplexy. And yet your brother writes of a hand behind his death and of a ledger. Your police, Sir Lestrade, most probably, were content? The police were scarcely present, said Markham. The doctor, the vicar, and a neighbour attended. Charles was buried 2 days later. Rapid, Holmes said. Rapid and convenient. The ledger your brother commands you to find. Did you disoblige his memory by prizing the desk with a penknife and a mallet? I did everything I could without destroying it, Markham said, colouring. I shook the drawers, pressed each corner, examined the underside, even measured the depth against the exterior. They accorded. Holmes nodded. Some secret drawers are not smaller but larger. We shall see it for ourselves. But before we do, indulge me in the impertinence I promised. Your cravat is tied in the oriental knot, tightened once, not twice, such as a man wears when he has washed hurriedly, but meant to dine. The sleeve of your left cuff shows a faint crease where a boutonniere's pin caught and dragged out, leaving no flower, an apology made and received without going to table. Your boots have a smear of red clay upon the inner heel. Rotherhithe foreshore after the morning tide, and the brim of your hat, which you hold too nervously to notice, bears a white dust I do not recognize at once, but which suggests to me a powdered pigment used in silk inspection to separate tight folds. All these tell me you have been to your brother's warehouse this morning, where you were received coolly, and that you left before noon to make your way to us, by way of your solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, for your card is new and uncreased and has only just been cut from a packet. Markham stared, his lips parted. By heaven, you are right in every particular. Mr. Chalmers, my solicitor, gave me the card and insisted upon applying the mutual acquaintance, Mr. Melas, who spoke of your powers. At the warehouse, the foreman was stiff and would not answer my questions. He said the books would show all that, needed showing. And yet there is, it seems, a book not meant for every eye. Holmes said, Come, Watson, your hat. Mr. Markham, you will accompany us. Bring the letter. As for the man in the street, he has no stomach to follow 3 where he would follow 1. He will report what he guesses to those who set him there. If he was set, we shall learn soon enough. We descended together, and Holmes stepped lightly out into the fog with that peculiar limp he sometimes assumed to alter his stature. The street contained only the muffled shapes of London moving within their own concerns. If our watcher remained, he was by then but an absence felt rather than a form seen. A hansom carried us eastward. London unfolded its familiar panorama. The pale river lights, the silhouettes of cranes like jointed insects against the pearly vapor, the cry of a bargee somewhere beyond sight. Markham sat forward, both hands upon his knees, and told us all he knew in a low, urgent voice. Charles inherited the importing business from our father, he said. He dealt in silks and other fine textiles from the Levant, the Indies, and lately from the German houses. This winter was difficult. There were rumors of a consignment spoiled by damp. He said little to me. We were not estranged, but reserved, as brothers sometimes are. Did he fear any man? Holmes asked without turning his head. I cannot say he feared, Markham replied after a pause. But he had, these past weeks, a certain watchfulness. He looked often over his shoulder. He would not drink wine poured if the decanter had stood long on the sideboard. I teased him for it, as brothers do. He did not laugh. The letter speaks of a hand near enough to strike again, I said. Whom would that hand strike now? Markham's jaw tightened. If Charles suspected his death, he would warn me for 2 reasons. To save me and to save the firm. There are obligations, debts, contracts incoming. If I were discredited, others would control the ledger. The ledger, Holmes repeated softly. Ah, the ledger. We must not grant that word a mere commonplace meaning, Watson. There are ledgers which record more than columns and sums. We crossed the river into that ragged district where commerce presses too close upon the dwellings of men. Markham directed the driver down a narrow lane and thence to a brick house with iron railings overlooked by a warehouse of 3 stories, the upper windows fitted with sliding shutters. The servant who admitted us said Mrs. Pike was out for eggs and that she had left no word of return. The study, however, was unlocked and held the melancholy air which rooms retain after the departure of a careful owner. Holmes paused upon the threshold and did not advance at once. I watched the set of his shoulders, the narrowing of his eyes. He breathed in, long and slow, as a hound might take the scent of a covert. Then, with a nod to me, he stepped inside. It was a handsome, sober chamber. A turkey carpet, a pair of club chairs, shelves bearing volumes of trade reports and a few works of travel. Upon the mantel lay the black band for a hat. The desk stood against the far wall before a window that looked upon a yard where bales might be landed from a cart. The desk was of fine mahogany with a green baize top, its drawers polished and their brass pulls bright. A heavy inkstand, a seal with the Markham crest, and a pen tray were arranged with exactitude. "Do not touch the desk," Holmes said softly. "Not yet. First, the floor." He knelt. Holmes, whose long limbs always gave me the impression of a coiled spring when he stooped, and studied the nap of the carpet. "Watson, a candle?" I brought one from the mantel and shielded it with my palm. The flame picked out the faint furrows made by chair legs, the ghostly arc where a boot had turned. 2 chairs were moved recently. One dragged, not lifted. See the trail along the weft? And there, a whitish dust near the skirting board, the same powder that kissed our letter's flap. Orris, yes, but mixed with... What is this? Not chalk. A starch, arrowroot, perhaps, used to dress textile samples. And there is a thread. Take it, Watson. I plucked it delicately. It was a short, pale filament, finer than ordinary cotton, yet not silk. It clung to my fingertip. Holmes looked to Markham. Your housekeeper dusts well, yet not well enough to erase the record of guests. Your brother received a visitor accustomed to powders used where fabrics are unfolded. A woman, most likely, for the thread is caught at a height which suggests a skirt brushed the board. She sat, rose, sat again, and went to the window to look out. See the small crescent upon the curtained sill where a ring pressed and left an indentation. Did your brother entertain ladies here? He was a widower, Mr. Holmes. Widower is a social state, Holmes said dryly, not a vow. But I do not think this was a romantic call. She came to speak of business, or to appear to speak of business. He crossed to the desk and examined the lock without opening it, his lens dancing like a firefly before the keyhole. Scratched at the lower quadrant. Someone unfamiliar with the key. Mr. Markham, you tried your brother's keys here? Yes. None fit. The desk has a separate key. Mrs. Pike keeps it in a little china dish in the pantry. She said so. But when I asked, she could not find it. She blamed her eyes. Her eyes or her conscience, Holmes murmured. No matter. You said the drawers accord in depth with their fronts. That is the oldest and most honest of deceits. This is not an honest deception." He ran his hand along the underside of the writing surface, then brought his knuckle down upon the baize. Once, twice, thrice, each tap returning a slightly different tone. On the fourth he smiled. "Watson, do you recollect the Count's escritoire in the matter of the 3 students?" "I do." "Then you recall that the false drawer is most perfect when it is no drawer at all." He pressed his thumb upon the right-hand corner of the baize. There was a minute click, a breath, nothing more, and a tongue of wood sprang out from beneath the ledge no thicker than a table knife. Holmes touched it, and a panel the breadth of a sheet of foolscap slid back so cunningly that I gasped. The cavity it revealed was empty. Holmes's face did not change, but the set of his mouth grew more attenuated. He slid the panel into place again and straightened. "Empty," said Markham in a hollow voice. "Then the ledger?" "Still exists," Holmes replied evenly, "and has merely changed custody. While your brother lay in that very room, a hand that knew this desk, or had been taught, came and took what was meant for you. The letter's phrase, 'bearer,' was intended to place trust in a messenger who never came. Someone intercepted the intention and made the post do the work of a thief." He went to the window and looked into the yard. The fog swirled and lifted a little, showing the black square of a side gate and the impressions of cart wheels dried into cakes of mud. "I think we have been watched in one place and forestalled in another," he said. "But there is compensation. A theft, like a death, disturbs the surface of things and leaves behind eddies. We have powder on the skirting, a ring's mark on the sill, a drawer opened by a clumsy key, and a housekeeper with a failing memory at a convenient hour. We shall see Mrs. Pike when she returns, and later we shall walk to your warehouse and ask your foreman impolite questions, politely. Our seafaring sentinel will report our movements. Let him. It will spare us the trouble of advertising our presence." He turned from the window and gave me a look I knew too well. "Watson, I require 2 small errands. First, the nearest chemist willing to part with a dram of tincture of iodine and a sheet of gummed paper. Second, a boy who can be trusted to carry a note as if it were a sovereign." "For what purpose?" I asked. "For seeing what the eye cannot see and testing who cannot help but look," he answered. "If a ledger is gone, its ghost may remain on the baize, and if a thief is cautious, curiosity remains his ruin. We shall leave a morsel where the cautious cannot resist pecking." It was then that the front bell rang. 2 quick strokes and 1 long. Holmes cocked his head as a spaniel does at a distant whistle. "Ah," he said lightly, "the first of our players returns. Let us receive her, if eggs it was. Then eggs it shall be, and discover whether Mrs. Pike prefers her omelettes seasoned with truth." Mrs. Pike entered with the self-possession of one accustomed to a household in which her word was seldom questioned. She was a woman of 50 or thereabouts, broad of shoulder, her dark gown neat but plain, and her bonnet still dusted with the fine mist of the fog. A small wicker basket swung from her arm, containing indeed a dozen eggs, their pale shells rattling faintly as she set them upon the side table. "Mr. Markham," she said with a curt inclination of the head, "I did not expect you back today. And these gentlemen, friends of yours?" Holmes, who had taken a position by the mantelpiece, regarded her with that air of polite disinterest which I knew to be as far from truth as the distance from Baker Street to the moon. "We are assisting Mr. Markham in a small inquiry regarding the household," he said. "It will not disturb your work." Mrs. Pike's glance moved to the desk, then back to Markham. "Small inquiry? About what?" "About your late master's affairs," Holmes replied smoothly, "and about a certain key to that desk which you keep in a china dish in the pantry." The woman's hands, which had been folding the string of her basket, stilled for the briefest fraction of a second before resuming their task. "The key's gone missing," she said. "I told Mr. Markham as much. I must have mislaid it weeks ago." "Mislaid," Holmes repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. Odd that it should be mislaid when the desk's contents might have proved of considerable interest. Her expression hardened. I do not care for your insinuations, sir. I have served this family 20 years. And in that time, Holmes said, you will have learned precisely who among your master's acquaintances bore powder upon their clothing, wore a ring upon the right hand that left a crescent in soft wood, and had the knowledge to open a desk without the correct key. Her eyes widened just perceptibly before she forced a short laugh. Powder? Rings? I know nothing of such matters. If someone's been in here, it wasn't me who let them. Holmes stepped toward her, his manner still courteous, but his gaze keen. You went out for eggs. How long were you absent? Half an hour, less. And the side gate to the yard, was it locked? She hesitated, then shook her head. I didn't check it. It's always kept shut. Holmes's glance flickered to me before returning to her. You will oblige me by thinking back to the day of your master's death. Did he receive a visitor that afternoon? Mrs. Pike fidgeted with her bonnet strings. There was a lady. Came just after luncheon. Said she had business with him about the silk orders. She was here an hour or more. And did you admit her? I did. She gave her name. Miss Howard, I think. Well-dressed. Said she came from one of the firms he dealt with. Holmes's voice was almost conversational. And when she left, did she take anything with her? The housekeeper's lips tightened. A small parcel. I thought nothing of it. Holmes's eyes glinted. A parcel that could easily have contained a ledger. I couldn't say. I didn't open it. Holmes allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make her shift her weight from foot to foot. Then he inclined his head. That will be all, Mrs. Pike. But if you should recall further details, such as the firm Miss Howard claimed to represent, you will inform Mr. Markham at once. When she had gone, Holmes moved to the window and looked down into the yard again. The ring mark, the powder, the skirt's thread, all consistent with our visitor. Mrs. Pike's reluctance to speak was not guilt of theft, but guilt of omission. She has been warned to keep her tongue behind her teeth. Markham spoke up sharply. Warned? By whom? By the same party who sent a seafaring sentinel to loiter outside Baker Street, Holmes said. One does not set a watch unless there is something to be lost by another's movements. And here, that something is a ledger. I could see the picture forming in Holmes's mind, though he kept the details from us. He paced the study once, twice, then stopped before the desk. Taking the iodine and gummed paper he had sent me for earlier, he moistened the paper slightly, pressed it gently upon the baize, and waited. When he lifted it, faint brown lines and blotches appeared, the ghost of handwriting that had rested there before the sheet was removed. Partial columns of figures, he murmured. And here, a name. Do you read it, Watson? I peered closer. It looks like F. Howard. Holmes's mouth curved in the faintest smile. Our Miss Howard, no doubt. And beneath it, Rotherhithe, dock consignment. Interesting. The red clay upon your heel, Mr. Markham, becomes relevant. Markham's brow furrowed. You mean to say my visit to the warehouse placed you in the same district mentioned in the ledger, Holmes finished. And it is in that district we shall likely find the next link in our chain. We left the study, Holmes instructing Markham to lock the door behind us and keep the key in his own pocket. The fog outside had thickened once more, wrapping the narrow street in a damp shroud. Holmes glanced up and down it before hailing a passing cab. To Rotherhithe, he told the driver, and quickly. As we rattled eastward, Holmes sat with his chin on his chest, eyes half closed. I had learned not to disturb him at such times. His mind was darting far ahead of the cab's progress, threading connections invisible to anyone else. Markham, on the other hand, was restless, his gaze darting to every passer-by as though expecting an attack. When at last we reached the riverfront, the smell of tar and salt filled the air. Cranes loomed like skeletal arms in the mist, and the creak of rigging came from ships moored in the black water. Holmes led us unerringly down a side alley to a warehouse whose upper windows were dark. "This," he said, "is the address given in the ledger's ghost. Observe the sign, F. Howard & Co. And note the shutter on the second floor, slightly ajar, though the others are tight shut. Someone is inside, though the hour is late for business." Markham clenched his fists. "Then let's confront them." Holmes's hand shot out to restrain him. "And alert them to our interest?" "No, Mr. Markham. We must see without being seen." He led us round to the back of the building where a narrow yard opened onto the river. There we found fresh wheel tracks in the damp earth, leading to a side door. Holmes bent to examine them. "A barrow or small cart, no more than 4 feet in length," he said. "And here, powder again, fallen from a skirt or apron." We waited in the shadows. Presently, the side door opened and a figure emerged, cloaked and hooded against the fog. Even at that distance, I caught the gleam of a ring on her right hand as she adjusted her cloak. She carried a flat, wrapped parcel under her arm. Holmes's eyes shone. "There goes our Miss Howard. Watson, keep to the left. I'll follow on the right. Mr. Markham, stay back. Your presence is known to her, and she may bolt if she sees you." The pursuit through the fog was a silent one. Miss Howard moved quickly, threading her way through lanes and alleys until she reached the broader thoroughfare leading toward the Surrey docks. Holmes and I kept parallel courses, using doorways and carts for cover. At last, she stopped before a low building whose windows were curtained despite the hour, and knocked 3 times in a particular rhythm. The door opened just enough to admit her and the parcel. Holmes drew me back into the shelter of an archway. "That building," he said softly, "is no shop, yet it receives deliveries under cover of night. We have stepped into a larger net, Watson, and the threads run far beyond a single letter posted after a funeral." He looked at me then, and in his expression I read that the game had deepened, and that we were only at the edge of its labyrinth. Holmes remained perfectly still in the shadows of the archway, his gaze fixed on the curtained windows of the low building. The faintest glow pulsed behind them, as if a lamp were being shaded and unshaded in some purposeful rhythm. I felt the cold mist creeping into my collar and longed to ask what he intended, but his posture warned me to silence. Only after several minutes, when the lamplight settled into steadiness and the street lay empty, did he turn his head slightly toward me. "Watson," he murmured, "observe that vent just above the lintel. Do you note the vapor? It is faint, but warmer than the night air. That tells us a stove or brazier burns inside, despite the mildness of the evening, a precaution taken when papers must be dried quickly or destroyed entirely." "Then you believe they have the ledger in there?" "I believe," he replied, "that whatever they hold within those walls will explain why a dead man's warning letter was altered and sent by post. The ledger may be one of several items at stake." He moved along the wall of the building, his footfalls soundless on the damp cobbles. I followed, keeping as close as the darkness allowed. At the rear, a narrow yard enclosed by high planks led to a small door secured with a heavy padlock. Holmes stooped, examined the lock by touch, and let out a faint breath. "Newly oiled," he whispered. "Used within the hour. No rust to betray long disuse. This door serves as much for convenience as for secrecy." He produced a thin length of steel from his coat. I had seen him open far more complex locks in the course of our adventures, and this one yielded to him with a soft click. The door swung inward a hand's breadth, releasing a gust of air tinged with the smell of hemp, ink, and that same faint orris and starch powder we had found in Markham's study. Holmes did not push it further. Instead, he pressed his ear to the opening. Somewhere beyond, muffled voices rose and fell. 2, perhaps 3 speakers. The tones were brisk, businesslike, without the hesitation of conspirators who fear every sound. Whoever they were, they felt secure behind their curtains. Holmes drew back and replaced the padlock without entering. "We have enough for tonight. To enter now would risk alerting them, and the game is too delicate. We shall let them think they work unobserved." "And what of Miss Howard?" I asked. "Shall we not follow her when she leaves?" Holmes shook his head. "Better to let her feel safe in her passage, for a frightened bird may abandon the nest." "No, Watson. Tonight we take note of the nest's location. Tomorrow we shall draw out its contents." We retraced our way to the main street where Markham waited under the lee of a shuttered shop. He started forward as we approached. "Well?" he demanded in a low voice. "We have seen enough to know your brother's affairs touch deeper waters than you supposed," Holmes said. "I counsel you to keep to your home tonight and speak to no one of our movements. The less forewarning our quarry has, the greater our advantage." Markham's brow was furrowed with frustration, but he nodded. "Very well. You will keep me informed?" "When it is time," Holmes replied. "For now, trust that we are following the correct scent." We parted there, sending Markham homeward in a separate cab, and Holmes and I took another toward Baker Street. The fog thinned as we went, revealing the glow of lamps on wet pavement and the black silhouettes of spire and chimney against the sky. Holmes leaned back, hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes far away. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall the faint trail of red clay on Markham's boot? The ledger's ghost speaks of a dock consignment. I believe the two are linked. Rotherhithe's clay, the textile powders, the name F. Howard. The combination suggests a transaction that could not bear the scrutiny of the official. Books smuggling, I ventured. Possibly, or the diversion of goods from their rightful destination. Silk, you see, is easily concealed in crates marked for other wares, and once landed in certain warehouses along the river, it can be passed into commerce without paying the proper duties. A ledger recording such substitutions would be worth a great deal, to its owner, to his rivals, and to the law. And to someone who feared its disclosure, I added. Precisely. Charles Markham may have discovered such dealings, perhaps even profited by them, and when his conscience or his safety demanded he act, the very evidence he meant to secure was stolen from under his nose. Back at Baker Street, Holmes was restless. He paced, smoked, and made a brief series of notes in his own precise hand before slipping them into an envelope addressed to an inspector at the River Police. "A request for certain names and ship arrivals," he explained when I asked. "If my suspicion is correct, one of those names will connect our Miss Howard to a particular vessel and a cargo that has already vanished." Morning came pale and cold, the fog lingering in ragged patches over the river. Holmes was ready before I had finished my breakfast. "We pay a call on the warehouse in daylight," he said. "Men grow careless under the sun. They think shadows alone conceal them." At Rotherhithe, the wharf bustled with the usual trade. Stevedores shouting, carts rumbling, gulls wheeling above the masts. Holmes led the way to the rear yard we had visited in the fog. The padlock was in place, but the wheel tracks of the night before were now partly obscured by the fresh prints of boots and barrows. A man emerged from the side door carrying a bundle of papers. He was thick-set, with a weathered face and the unmistakable roll of a seaman in his gait. Holmes intercepted him with the air of an idle inquirer. "Fine day for business," Holmes remarked. The man gave him a sharp glance. "Who's asking?" "A fellow with a passing interest in the import trade," Holmes said amiably. "I was told Miss Howard might be found here." At the name, the man's expression flickered, just for an instant, but Holmes noted it. "She's out," he said shortly. "Won't be back till later." Holmes thanked him and let him go without pressing. We wandered a short distance away before Holmes stopped at a corner where he could watch the yard unseen. "That reaction told me all I needed," he said. "He knows her, and her presence here is not a matter for open discussion. We shall wait." An hour passed before Miss Howard appeared, stepping from a cab with her parcel conspicuously absent. She went inside without looking around. Moments later, the same seafaring fellow slipped out the back, locked the door, and set off at a brisk pace toward the docks. Holmes nudged my arm. "Our watcher from Baker Street, I think," he said. "And now he carries no weapon? His coat hangs too close for it. Perhaps he has delivered it elsewhere." We followed him to a tavern near the water's edge. He entered, greeted the landlord with the familiarity of a regular, and vanished into a private room at the back. Holmes approached the bar, ordered a small ale, and inquired whether Captain Briggs was in. The landlord nodded toward the closed door. "Aye, with a lady." Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Indeed? And would that be Miss Howard?" The landlord grinned, showing broken teeth. "That's her. Always comes to see Briggs when she's in town." Holmes drained his ale and set the tankard down. "We have our chain, Watson, Howard, Briggs, and the ledger. One more link and the trap can be set." He guided me outside, his step quickening. "We shall let them conduct their meeting without interruption. By nightfall, I mean to have the river police in position. If my reading is correct, a certain cargo is due to be moved this evening, and our conspirators will think it safe to proceed. That is when we strike." The resolve in his tone left no doubt that the next move would be decisive. Whatever game had begun with a letter posted after a funeral was drawing rapidly toward the moment when hidden hands would be forced into the open. Holmes lost no time once we had quitted the tavern. He strode along the embankment with that rapid, loose-limbed gait which, for all its apparent carelessness, eats up ground like a trotter. The gulls swooped and cried above the black sheen of the river, barges nosed down on the tide, their lanterns dull in the pale day. He paused only to purchase a slip of blue notepaper from a chandler, and there penciled 2 brief lines with his silver stump of a pencil. "To Inspector Mordaunt, Thames Division, Wapping," he said, folding and sealing it with a daub of wax warmed over the chandler's lamp. "A request. Watch is to be set upon the yard of F. Howard and Company, and upon a certain tavern wherein Captain Briggs receives his private callers. I add a mark for a lighter called the Swallow. If my hypothesis is wrong, we have lost a half-day. If right, we shall gain a ledger and a murderer." A crossing boy sped off with the note, a shilling doubling his zeal. Holmes turned to me. "Our quarry will stir under 2 prods, Watson. Pressure on the water and pressure on land. I will take the water. You, with your medical standing, will obtain a word with Dr. Elphinstone. There is a sourness in that tidy apoplexy which I do not relish. Ask him for his sequence and for the precise moment of death certified. Watch, above all, whether he wishes to hurry you out of his door." "I shall go at once," said I. "And take this," he added, handing me a visiting card on which he had scratched 2 letters. F. H. Should you see any letterhead, nor be able to copy it, note whether the flourish beneath the H falls left or right of the downstroke. We may have 2 Howards, and one of them a mask. We parted there. I secured a cab for Bermondsey and found Dr. Elphinstone at his surgery, a neat, narrow house with a brass plate and geraniums bravely facing the soot. He was a spare man of 40 with pale lashes and a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose as if to compress his thoughts into obedience. My name, coupled with the mention of Holmes, earned me a constrained civility. "You attended the late Mr. Charles Markham," I began. "As a medical man, you will understand my wish for exactitude." "To a degree," he returned, "but the matter is concluded, Doctor. Watson, it was a shock to me as to all. Mr. Markham's constitution was sound, yet a vessel bursts and God claims his own." "Indeed," I said, "you were with him at the moment." "I was called. The housekeeper sent a boy. I went within 20 minutes. 20, I repeated. "Mrs. Pike spoke of a neighbor first." He frowned. "No neighbor. I was the first physician. I found Mr. Markham insensible upon the study rug. The pulse was thready, then absent. There were no convulsions, no frothing. The face was not distorted. I certified what was evident. You observed the pupils? He stared at me. Large. But in death there are vagaries, Doctor. Watson, quite, I said mildly. One more trifle. Did you remark upon any odor, almond, bitter, or peculiar? Certainly not, he said quickly. Too quickly, I thought. And if this is to insinuate poison, you are in error. Mr. Markham had told me a week prior of a heaviness here. He touched his temple. A tendency to vertigo. I prescribed nothing beyond rest. He stood as if to close the interview. My eye, roving as it will in a fellow practitioner's room, fell upon his prescription book open on the desk and, beside it, a sheet torn from a pad bearing in flourished copperplate. F. Howard and Company, importers and commission agents, Rotherhithe. The flourish beneath the H fell to the right of the downstroke, looping like a fishhook, just as it had upon the warehouse sign. Your patients are various, I remarked, nodding at the paper. He snapped the book shut, and the hand with which he did so trembled slightly. Businessmen and bargemen alike, Dr. Watson. Good day. I knew better than to press him further then, but I did not leave empty-handed. In the hallway a boy waited, cap twisting in his fists. The same runner, I suspected, who had fetched Elphinstone to Markham. A coin and a promise of another if he returned to Baker Street brought me, within minutes, his recollection. Mrs. Pike sent me, sir, but before I got there, the neighbour, Mr. Collard, from 2 doors, he'd gone to fetch the doctor from Dock Street, but Dr. Elphinstone weren't in. Then I met him coming round by the lane. He said as he'd been delayed at the warehouse, seen to a hand with a crushed finger. A delay, then. A neighbour, too. Both omitted from Elphinstone's version. I thanked the lad and set off for the Markham warehouse with my suspicions bristling. The foreman, a square-guarded man named Hardwick, met me at the office door as if he had been posted to intercept unwanted visitors. He had a careful politeness, like one balancing a loaded tray. I come at Mr. Geoffrey Markham's request, I told him. We seek to place the affairs in order. Everything's in order, he returned. Bales checked, shipments tallied. On whose books? I asked. He glanced aside. Company's own. Not F. Howard's. That brought his gaze back sharp as a fish dart. We don't deal with them direct, at most by brokers. Then you will have no objection to my noting your recent consignments. His politeness thinned, but he led me to a tall press filled with folios. I turned pages while he watched my hands. Twice I caught a faint dusting of fine white upon the margins, the same starch-dressed powder. On a memorandum lodged out of sequence, a careless pen had written F. Howard, Pons, Briggs, Swallow, and the date of that very day. The flourish beneath the H was the same hooked rightward sweep. Hardwick's eyes narrowed when he saw I had seen. Clerk's mistake, he said. A scrap put in the wrong file. It don't signify. It signifies sufficiently, I said, and closed the book. When I reached Baker Street at mid-afternoon, I found Holmes already returned, a fisher's cap on the hearth rug, his own violin propped on the chair, and a thin stratum of river grit upon his cuffs. He greeted me without preface. You're Elphinstone. Defensive and inaccurate, I said, giving him the gist. He denied a neighbour, denied delay, denied odour. Yet the neighbour exists, the delay is admitted by the boy, and the letterhead of F. Howard lay upon his desk like a challenge. Holmes's eyes brightened. Good, good. The web threads cross where they should. I have my own fibres to add. The Thames men answered promptly. Mordaunt knows Briggs of old. A water rat with silver whiskers, he called him. The Swallow is a lighter that comes and goes under a dozen charters. But tonight, at the first of the flood, she is booked to take 4 crates from Howard's yard to a barque for Hamburg. The crates are marked hardware, but they ring dull to a tapping stick. Silk, Watson, and inside the silk, perhaps, other slips of paper than invoices. The ledger? I breathed. Or a section of it, Holmes returned. A careful thief does not lug a tome when a sheaf will do. Moreover, Miss Howard does not traffic in ledgers when she can traffic in leverage. She visits Briggs at noon, the yard at 1, and a low house near the docks at night. We shall touch each post upon that course. But not yet. First, a word with Geoffrey Markham. Markham came within the hour, brought by our note. He listened to our recitals, growing pale, then read. You suspect smuggling, then? That Charles connived at it? We suspect a ledger of a kind that men kill for, Holmes said coolly. Whether your brother wrote it to confess or to conceal has yet to be proved. Did he quarrel lately with any partner? Partner? He had none. Only contracts. There was a German house, Baumann and Son, complaining of shortages, and a gentleman of the Levant Company disliked his change of broker, but Charles swore his tallies were clean. His tallies on the books, Holmes corrected. And on the private book? Markham looked stricken. He did not confide such a thing to me. Then let us assume he meant to and was forestalled, said Holmes. You were watched for a reason, Mr. Markham. If you receive approaches, amiable or threatening, you will bring the words to me verbatim. Markham promised, but as he took his leave, the door below was thrown open, and a clatter of boots upon our stair announced a visitor less biddable. Inspector Lestrade burst in with his familiar briskness, and a newspaper folded like a cudgel. So you are in it, Mr. Holmes, he cried without preamble. And you, Doctor, trust you two to be sniffing when the wind is foul. There's been a blaze at Rotherhithe, low building in Limekiln Lane, papers burned near to ash, and a man, Clark by the look, near suffocated before they dragged him out. Alive? Holmes asked sharply. Barely, and off to Guy's, said Lestrade. Name not known, but here's the rub. A cove swears blind he saw Mr. Geoffrey Markham skulk from the alley not 5 minutes before the cry of fire, and I have a report that a letter came to Mr. Markham yesterday from his dead brother, and that the letter told of a ledger. I'm not an imaginative man, Mr. Holmes, but I can imagine quite enough to justify a few firm questions. Markham, who had half risen at the first words, now stood stiff as a pikestaff, his face working. Inspector, I've not set foot in Limekiln Lane today. No, Lestrade returned. Then you will not mind showing me the soles of your boots. Markham flushed. This is preposterous. Holmes interposed, his voice smooth as lacquer. Inspector, before you convert conjecture into handcuffs, consider a fact or two. The man you want for observation is Captain Briggs. The woman you want for questions is Miss F. Howard. The conveyance you want to watch is a lighter called the Swallow, and the hour you wish to be ready is the first of the flood this evening. If you follow Mr. Markham, you will net a client. If you follow the river, you may net a conspiracy. Lestrade's eyes snapped. I have my duty, Mr. Holmes, which includes attending to witnesses who name a gentleman at the scene of a felony. If Mr. Markham will oblige me to the station, I shall meanwhile send a sergeant to Wapping to see about your Swallow. Holmes's face did not change, but the long veins stood out upon his thin hand. He turned to Markham. Go with the inspector, he said quietly. Say little and nothing more than true. Send to me if you are held after dusk. Lestrade, you will find me in Rotherhithe when the tide turns. The two went out together, Lestrade dogged, Markham stiff with injured pride. Holmes did not watch them to the door. He was already at the mantel, the violin under his chin. He drew from it a few grave notes that fell upon the room like measured drops. Then he set the instrument aside and became all steel and wire. We are where they wished us, Watson, pulled toward a false blaze while the real cargo moves. Yet their haste betrays them. Fire to clear a cupboard is a poor tool when water stands so near. We shall go by the back lanes, and we shall be eyes where they think only smoke. We took the understreets to the river, that intricate skein of alleys and courts where the stones are slick and the air smells of rope and beer. The crowd had already thinned at Limekiln Lane. The little house smouldered, its windows black sockets in a red-scaled face. A knot of idlers gaped at a fireman bringing out a charred metal corner. the remnant, I saw, of a ledger's binding. Holmes bent as if to tie his shoe. When he rose, his palm held a scrap of singed paper with a single line of figures and a stationer's imprint too oiled to have burned clean. Hunter and Sons, Threadneedle Street. A ledger bound not by a dockside scrivener, but by a city shop, Holmes said under his breath, and therefore commissioned by a man who wished permanence to his records. A constable, recognizing Holmes, volunteered that the clerk had come round enough to say only, "Ring right hand," and then swooned again. Holmes's eyes flashed once. Approval, I thought, that the poor fellow had offered the truth in a word where a tale might have been confused. The light was beginning to flatten toward evening when Holmes drew me aside into a doorway opposite Howard's yard. "The trap closes," he said. "The Swallow will nose in at dusk. Briggs will keep his appointment unless warned. Miss Howard will think her papers ash. We shall be a trifling inconvenience to their plans. Mordaunt's men lie half a street off to the east. When the carts roll, we shall roll with them, and when the crates are lifted, we shall be near enough to hear the silk sigh. But one thing remains." He took from his pocket a workman's cap and settled it low upon his brow. A smear of river grime altered his cheekbones. His shoulders sloped in an instant. "They have seen Watson and Markham in decent coats and Holmes at a distance. They have not seen a lighter man with a cough and a taste for gin. If I speak to Briggs face to face, he may show me the gap in the fence for the price of a draught. You go alone?" "For a turn or two down the alley. Then I shall be by your side." He clapped my arm. "Keep your watch by the yard gate. If the first crate moves before I return, follow it like my good spaniel Toby used to, nose to ground and tail to truth." He melted into the traffic as if the fog had taken him for its own. Alone, I kept my station, my heart drumming a cautionary tattoo. The lane grew busier. 2 men with shoulders hunched under their coats. A boy whistling with more bravado than tune. A woman with a covered basket and the glint of a ring when she adjusted her shawl. Right hand, I noted, and my pulse leapt. She passed inside Howard's with no knock at all. Moments later, a low whistle sounded from the river, and a lighter's lantern bobbed into view through the paling mist. The first crate, slung on a short pole between 2 porters, came out to the gate. The silk within must have been densely packed, for they went careful, grunting softly, their boots sucking in the damp earth. I glanced down the street for Holmes. There was no sign of him. Duty wrenched at me. I fell in step at a distance as the men bore their burden along the wharf. A mere shadow among shadows. My senses strained for the signal I knew must come. The Swallow shifted her nose to the quay, and Captain Briggs himself, with his grizzled beard and rolling stride, stepped forward to oversee the taking on. The parcel passed within his reach. He lifted the lid a finger's breadth, so slight a motion that only a watcher upon his very shoulder would have remarked it, and then snapped it shut with a satisfied grunt. "Right then," he growled. "Next." I kept to the shadows along the wharf, watching as the men brought a second crate from the yard. The mist off the river had thickened, swallowing sound and movement alike, so that only the muffled tread of boots and the occasional thump of wood on wood betrayed their work. Briggs oversaw each load with a practiced eye, his stance shifting to the rhythm of the tide beneath his vessel. His manner was neither hurried nor careless. There was confidence in every motion, the confidence of one certain that his work would pass unremarked. I edged closer under cover of a stack of coiled rope. Close enough now to catch a fragment of conversation. One of the porters muttered something about the lady and final payment, to which Briggs replied with a short, satisfied laugh. That laugh carried something of triumph, and it told me these crates were more than contraband. They were the closing act of a profitable scheme. The third crate was lighter. The men carried it with greater ease, but Briggs gave it the same narrow inspection. This time he turned his head slightly, scanning the shadows. I kept still, my breath held, and let my gaze shift past him to the yard gate. There, at last, I saw Holmes. Or rather, I recognized him beneath the grime and stoop of the lighter man he had become. He emerged from between two drays as if he belonged to the riverfront, his gait slow, almost weary, and his eyes downcast. He drifted nearer to the loading without appearing to watch it, and when Briggs turned to shout an order, Holmes shuffled forward and spoke low enough that I caught only the cadence, not the words. Briggs's brow furrowed, then smoothed. He barked a short reply and jerked his thumb toward the vessel. Holmes nodded, coughed into his sleeve, and moved aside, disappearing behind a stack of timber. Whatever had passed between them had not raised suspicion. If anything, it seemed to have cemented his presence as a harmless laborer. The final crate emerged, carried not by 2 men, but 3, its weight evident in the set of their shoulders. Briggs supervised its journey to the gangplank as though it were made of glass. The lantern light caught his face for a moment, and I saw the keen attention there. This was the one that mattered most. As it reached the deck, a signal moved along the crew. Swift hands lashed it down, the others stowed with less ceremony. From the darkness at my left, a faint movement drew my eye. A figure in a hooded cloak was crossing the cobbles with unhurried grace. The lamplight slid across her face just long enough for me to see Miss Howard. She did not approach Briggs or the ship directly. Instead, she paused by the yard gate and exchanged a few quiet words with the seafaring fellow I had earlier seen loitering near Baker Street. Then, with the calm assurance of someone who had already verified her arrangements, she turned away and melted into the alley behind the warehouses. The loading complete, Briggs clapped his hands together and called for the mooring lines. The Swallow began to ease from the quay, her hull shifting with the pull of the tide. I glanced toward the street, expecting at any moment to see Inspector Mordaunt's men descend. The fog made distance deceptive, but soon the outline of 2 constables appeared at the far end of the wharf. They moved casually, as if on routine patrol, but their steady advance betrayed purpose. Holmes reappeared at my side without warning. "All 4 aboard," he murmured, "and our captain believes me a broken-down lighter man begging for a berth tomorrow. That will keep his eyes from me for the present." "And Mordaunt?" I asked. "In position," he replied. "The Swallow will not pass the second bend before a police cutter intercepts her. But our work is not yet done here. Those who remain ashore may still attempt to spirit away what they believe too dangerous to keep on the water." Even as he spoke, a flicker of movement caught my attention. A pair of men slipping out from the yard gate, carrying between them a small but heavy satchel. They took the opposite direction from Miss Howard, hugging the shadows of the wall. Holmes's gaze followed them, his eyes narrowing. "Not silk," he said softly. "Too compact. Paper, Watson. Paper, or something as valuable to the mind as silk is to the body. Come." We followed at a careful distance, our footsteps muffled by the damp stones. The men kept to back alleys, clearly familiar with the warren, of lanes. Once they paused, listening. We pressed ourselves into a doorway until they moved on. The satchel's shape shifted slightly as they walked, its contents loose within but well padded. At last, they stopped before a small side door in a building whose windows were boarded from the inside. One of them knocked in a sharp sequence, and the door opened a crack. A hand reached out to take the satchel. Holmes stepped forward at once, his voice cutting through the fog like a whip. "I should advise you to hold it there." The 2 men spun around, one reaching for a knife. Before he could bring it up, I had my revolver in hand. Holmes, with the speed of a striking snake, wrenched the satchel from the outstretched hand and thrust it under his arm. The door slammed from within. The men, seeing the odds, bolted down the lane. Holmes made no move to pursue. "We have the morsel they meant to swallow," he said with grim satisfaction. "The question is, will it prove to be the ledger itself or merely a scrap meant to draw us off?" We withdrew to a quieter corner before opening the satchel. Within, wrapped in oilskin, lay a bound volume of considerable weight. The binding was scorched at one corner, as though it had been rescued in haste from the lime-kiln lane fire. Holmes turned the cover back just enough to reveal the first page, a neat column of names, dates, and amounts, all in the same precise hand. "It is the ledger," he said, and his tone carried both triumph and caution. "But not, I suspect, the whole of it. These entries run only to December. If there is a continuation, Miss Howard will have kept it close, and she will know by now that we have this portion." From the direction of the river came a muffled shout, followed by the faint echo of another. Holmes glanced up. That will be the cutter hailing the Swallow. Mordaunt will have his prize, and Lestrade may yet have his culprit, though whether Markham will be cleared before dawn depends on how quickly we can place this book in the proper context. We made our way back toward the main thoroughfare, the ledger secured in Holmes's coat. The gas lamps cast long spears of light through the fog, and I fancied every passer-by gave us a second look. When we reached the mouth of Baker Street, Holmes slowed. "Tonight's work has yielded the core of the thing," he said, "but not the motive. Why did Charles Markham, knowing himself in danger, choose to write to his brother in terms that could so easily be twisted? And why does the presence of Miss Howard's name in these columns make her risk so much to retrieve them?" I could only shake my head. Holmes mounted the stairs 2 at a time, the weariness of the night swept aside by the fierce energy of pursuit. "We will have answers, Watson, before the sun is up," he said. "For when a spider's web is shaken at one strand, the vibrations travel to the center, and our spider, I think, is even now deciding whether to flee or to bite." Holmes set the ledger on the table with the care of a man placing a volatile chemical upon a laboratory bench. The lamplight caught the sheen of the oilskin, and for a moment neither of us spoke. He drew a chair close, flipped the cover open, and began turning the pages with slow, deliberate precision. "Note, Watson," he said, his eyes following the columns. "Each entry is coded with a set of initials and a symbol. The initials change, H, B, M. But the symbol at the end is constant, a small circle with a diagonal stroke. I have seen this mark before." I leaned over his shoulder. "Where?" "In the margin of certain shipping manifests at the customs house. Those for cargoes which arrived fully tallied on paper, but short in fact. A mark used, I believe, to indicate a consignment diverted before official inspection. Our Miss Howard and Captain Briggs have not been plying a small trade. They have been operating a systematic leakage from multiple importers, hidden in legitimate goods, then sold through intermediaries." "And Charles Markham?" I asked. Holmes tapped one page midway through the book. "Here, CM, twice, once in September, once in November. The sums are smaller than the others, which suggests he came to the enterprise late, perhaps unwillingly. But the fact that his name appears at all would be enough to ruin him if the ledger fell into the wrong hands. It is my guess he determined to remove himself from the affair, perhaps to expose it, and for that he was silenced." "By poison," I said quietly. Holmes glanced at me with a thin smile. "You have not forgotten Dr. Elphinstone's hesitation. Good. We shall return to him in due course. But first, the second half of this ledger. It will be with Miss Howard, and she will know by now that her portion is incomplete. That knowledge will spur her to act, and our task is to predict in which direction." He closed the book and leaned back, his fingers steepled. "She cannot approach Briggs. By dawn he will be in custody, nor can she reach into the river police offices to tamper with what Mordaunt has seized. That leaves one avenue, removing any other witness or evidence that could link her to this trade. The most obvious is Geoffrey Markham. Lestrade may have taken him to the station, but she will not know how closely he is guarded. You think she might try to silence him?" "I think she must," Holmes said, "and we shall be there before she arrives." Within minutes, we were in a cab bound for Scotland Yard. Holmes said little, his gaze fixed on the blurred lights of the city rushing past the window. The rain had begun again, fine as mist, and the reflections of the gas lamps quivered on the wet pavement. At the yard, Lestrade received us with a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. "You're Mr. Markham's in an interview room," he said. "Not under arrest, yet, but I can't keep him here all night without—" "Judge, keep him here another hour," Holmes said, "and place a man in the corridor. Watson and I will take the adjoining room with the lights low. If anyone attempts to gain entry who is not a yard officer, detain them without noise." Lestrade's brows rose, but he gave the order. Within minutes, we were in the shadowed room next to where Markham sat, his voice a dull murmur through the partition. The corridor outside was quiet, save for the creak of a constable shifting his weight. The first half-hour passed without incident, then the faintest scuff of a shoe reached my ear, a different cadence from the constable's measured tread. A light tap at Markham's door followed, and a woman's voice, soft and urgent. "It's all right. I've come to help you. They'll be here in a moment to release you." Holmes was already moving. He slipped through the connecting door with the silence of a cat, his hand emerging from his coat with a small revolver. I followed in time to see the visitor, hood drawn low, step into the light. She was tall, her movements deliberate, and though the shadow hid most of her face, the glint of the ring on her right hand was enough. "Miss Howard," Holmes said, his tone almost cordial. "So good of you to come to us instead of forcing us to chase you through the docks." She froze, then straightened, her chin lifting. "You've no right." "I have the right of a man holding the other half of your ledger," Holmes interrupted. "The Swallow is seized, Briggs is in custody, and your associates on land have dropped a very incriminating satchel into my hands. All that remains is for you to tell me whether you poisoned Charles Markham before or after you decided to steal his book." Her eyes flicked toward Markham, who had risen in confusion. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but there was a tremor now in her voice. Holmes stepped closer. "You visited him the afternoon of his death. You sat in his study, left a ring mark on the sill, and brushed powder from your skirt onto the skirting board. You brought with you a key that opened his desk just enough to reach the false drawer, and when you left, you carried the ledger in a neat parcel, telling Mrs. Pike it concerned silk orders. Hours later, Dr. Elphinston certified his death as apoplexy. No questions asked, no examination made. Convenient for you, less so for him." The mask slipped then, her eyes hardened. "You think you can prove any of that?" "I think," Holmes said, "that when Dr. Elphinstone is confronted with the contents of the ledger, entries showing payments to his initials as well as yours, he will decide that cooperation offers him more comfort than a trial. And once he talks, we will have a very clear picture of the arrangement between you, Briggs, and certain men in the customs house." Her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut. Holmes nodded toward the doorway, where Lestrade had appeared, his face alight with the satisfaction of a man who sees his net closing. "Take her," Holmes said simply, "and see that she and the good doctor are not given the chance to confer before we've spoken to each separately." Markham sagged into his chair as she was led away, his relief tempered by the shock of how close danger had come. Holmes regarded him with a measured look. "You were fortunate, Mr. Markham, that your brother's last act was to send that letter. Though it was intercepted and altered, it still brought you to Baker Street and set the whole affair in motion." "I owe you my life," Markham said. "You owe your life to your brother's foresight," Holmes corrected. "I have merely ensured that his warning was not wasted." We left the yard past midnight. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets gleaming under the lamps. Holmes walked in silence until we were halfway to Baker Street, then said, "One point still puzzles me. Why send the letter after the funeral?" I suggested it might have been written earlier and held back by the killer until it could serve another purpose. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, likely meant to draw Markham into a meeting where the same fate could befall him. But the desk's empty drawer forced them to move faster. The blaze at Limekiln Lane was their attempt to destroy what they could not yet remove. In their haste, they overlooked that a ledger leaves traces even when half burned, and that there are still men in London willing to see justice done on the water. He quickened his pace then, the night air sharpening his features. "Come, Watson. I suspect Lestrade will want us back in the morning for the formal statements, and before then I mean to have the second half of the ledger on this table. Our spider may be in the net, but I want every strand of her web before I let it be swept away." At dawn, Holmes was already abroad, and when I came down I found but a penciled line on the breakfast tray, Threadneedle Street, and a cold kidney staring up at me like a moral. He returned within the hour, the east wind in his coat and the gleam of the hunt in his eye. "Hunter and Sons keep a ledger of ledgers," he said, tossing his gloves to the grate. Our burned binding was one of a pair. The order was placed 3 months ago in a clerkly hand that uses a legal long S, rare nowadays, and paid for in cash. Delivery, 1 to F, Howard, Rotherhithe, the second to O. Collard, Customs House. "Collard!" I exclaimed. "The neighbour Mrs. Pike named." "The same," said Holmes. "And an officer at the river's gate, whose private mark, I believe, is our little circled stroke. It requires but a willing examiner to look past the bales that ought to be looked into. The web centres not in Miss Howard at all, but in a gentleman whose window overlooks Charles Markham's door." He rang for coffee and took the ledger from the cabinet where we had locked it. "Observe these later leaves, Watson. The hand grows more cramped, the spacing tightens. A book filled in haste. Why? Because its twin had been begun by a different pen." He tapped December's last entry. "Here is where our second volume must take up. We shall not root it out by rummaging cellars. We shall make the spider bring it. What do you propose? First, to co-opt our housekeeper who is not ours, Mrs. Pike. She lied by omission, but not from malice. She is a woman who has been told it is safer to forget. We shall give her something to remember and someone to give it to. Then, since Mr. Collard is both neighbour and sentinel, we shall grant him an errand which he will not resist. Lestrade shall have his cordon at the end of it." Within the half hour, we were once more at the Markham house. The fog had thinned to a grey veil and the square was waking. A sweep of a broom, a milkman's cry, the distant throb of the river. Mrs. Pike admitted us, hard-mouthed but not hostile. Holmes softened his voice to that tone of consideration which I have heard turn obstinate witnesses as the sun turns frost. "You regret what has happened, Mrs. Pike. Regret is an honest thing when it leads to amending the mischief done." "I don't know what you mean by mischief," she returned, but her eyes slid towards the study door. "You admitted a lady who took a parcel. You sent a boy for a doctor and said nothing of the neighbour who had already been sent. You mislaid a key. You have been frightened, and with reason. But the men who frightened you are less terrible when taken singly than they seem in the pack. Will you set one of them before the light where others cannot crowd behind him?" She was silent, twisting the corner of her apron. "Mr. Collard," she said at last, very low. "He told me to keep my nose in my pans and my tongue behind my teeth. Said the police would make it hard for me if I spoke wrong. He's been civil these years. I didn't want trouble." "Nor do we," said Holmes. "Trouble is best avoided by taking it once, cleanly. You will write, no, you will carry, 2 sentences to Mr. Collard's door. You will say that Mr. Geoffrey Markham, having found the other book, begs Mr. Collard to step in at 8 this evening to identify certain entries before the police are sent for. You will add that the desk stands open and the house will be quiet. May I rely on you to repeat the words exactly?" She looked from him to me and back again, reading, I think, not our faces, but our resolution. "I can do that." "Excellent," said Holmes, and his eyes, which could be as cold as flint, warmed by a degree. "You will speak only to Mr. Collard. If any other asks, you have told no one." When she had gone to her errand, Holmes walked the study like a general laying out guns. He knelt again at the desk's false edge and showed me where the panel would spring. He dusted the rim of the cavity with a puff of fine lampblack and smeared the keyhole with the lightest trace of a gummy varnish. "A childish trick," he said at my lifted brow. "Childish means our best when a childish vanity is to be caught. He will wish to show that he knows more of the desk than Geoffrey Markham ever will. He will touch what he should not, and he will carry the proof upon him." We drew the curtains half across and set the lamp low. He took from his pocket a small ivory whistle of curious shape and placed it upon the mantel. "For Mordaunt," he said, "a key the river men know in fog. Lestrade has his men about the square, but it is the back which is our concern, the little gate to the yard where a man might slip rather than face the front." "And Dr. Elphinstone?" I asked. "If Collard is the web's centre, where does the doctor hang?" "In a strand that will snap as soon as he feels the pull," said Holmes. I visited him after leaving Hunter and Sons. His waiting room was empty, and his shoe scraper held a thread of white filature. He has been to Howard's again. He smelt faintly of the same orris and starch. When Lestrade places Miss Howard before him with the ledger between, his nerve will go to water, but we do not need his confession tonight. We need Mr. Collard's hand in our drawer. We supped in the dining room at 6, a hasty and joyless meal, for the very plates seemed to listen for footsteps. At 7, the dusk was down, and the lamplighter's pole had bobbed along the row. 7:30 struck from St. Jude's, muffled by fog. Holmes drew a shabby cloak over his shoulders and pulled a gardener's cap low. To my astonishment, he took the chair by the window, slouched into it, and seemed to sink an inch into the very upholstery. "I am Mrs. Pike's brother, home from Gravesend. With a cough," he murmured, eyes half shut. "You will be the grieving doctor who has been called back to see whether Mr. Markham slept. If I am wrong, we lose an evening. If I am right, hush." There was a faint scrape in the areaway below, a shoe-testing brick, a soft trial at the latch of the side gate, then the whisper of it yielding. Holmes' hand, which had lain loose upon the chair arm, became wire under the sleeve. We heard the careful tread cross the yard, pause beneath the study window, then continue to the kitchen passage. The handle of the study door turned as if pushed by a cat's paw. A figure slid inside, closed the door, and stood, listening. He was a compact man in a well-cut coat with the modest decorum of the civil service. The gaslight glinted on his neat grey whisker and upon the small signet on his right hand. He moved with assurance to the desk, glanced once about him, not for men, but for disorder, and made a tiny sound of disapproval at the lamp's level. Then, with the unhurried ease of long acquaintance, he laid 2 fingers upon the base's right-hand corner and pressed. The panel leapt. He smiled. In the instant of his satisfaction, Holmes was no longer a lumpen shadow, but upon him like a spring let loose. I was at his shoulder with the revolver, while Holmes's long arm pinned the newcomer's wrist and brought his hand, palm down, against the varnished keyhole. The man did not cry out. He merely froze, the calculating eyes flying once to the false drawer and once to the curtain's line. "Mr. Oswald Collard, I think," said Holmes softly. "Pray keep perfectly still. The varnish plays the very devil with worsted. Watson, the door." I locked it while Holmes produced the tiny ivory whistle and blew the lowest of notes. A moth's sigh. Somewhere beyond the yard a similar breath answered. There was then the faintest stir in the lane. Collard, to do him justice, mastered his surprise. "This is an outrage," he said with severest propriety. "I came at Mr. Markham's request to assist in preventing the police laying hands upon private papers which might be misconstrued." "Ah," murmured Holmes, "you came to prevent misconstruction by constructing the papers elsewhere. You will observe your palm, sir." He lifted the hand he still held. In the lamplight, the gummy varnish had taken the impression of the keys escutcheon, and the dusting of lamp-black had left a neat black crescent along the fleshy base of the thumb. "A pretty memento," Holmes went on. "It will be handsomer still upon the cuff of your coat when Lestrade takes it as evidence that you did what Geoffrey Markham never did. Open the place where certain documents were once kept. Now, while we are so amicably placed, perhaps you will tell me where the second ledger lies." Collard's gaze remained cool. I declined to acknowledge any such thing. "A pity," said Holmes, "because without it, Miss Howard's testimony will do you more harm than good. She will say you marked the manifests and took your share in gold, that you warned her when inspections were to be severe, that you advised the form of the fire at Limekiln Lane." His voice hardened. "But it is not smuggling that concerns me tonight. It is murder. Charles Markham's pupils were wide when Elphinstone arrived. A man who dies of apoplexy does not usually look surprised." For the first time, the composure slipped a hair's breadth. He glanced, not at me, nor at Holmes, but at the mantel where the whistle lay. The eye dropped, returned to Holmes, then to the false drawer as if judging distances and times. Holmes's grip tightened. "Do not," he said in a very gentle voice, "attempt the folly you are weighing. You will not cross this room before the yard crosses the yard." There was a rap at the kitchen door, a constable's low cough, Lestrade's quick tread, and in another moment the inspector stood before us with 2 men at his back. "Well, Mr. Collard," said Lestrade cheerfully, "the night air not good in your street? We'll find you a warmer place." "Inspector," Collard returned with a hint of weary dignity, "this will make a ridiculous story in the morning. You will be obliged to apologize to the board." "I'll oblige the board with the other half of a book," Lestrade snapped, "and then the board can oblige you with a cell. Take him." They secured him, and Holmes, with that curious courtesy he always extended to a fallen antagonist, brushed the black crescent from the man's hand with his handkerchief before the cuff could take it. "No need to gift him a souvenir," he murmured to me. Then, aloud to Lestrade, "He will have left the second volume where a man of habit leaves a hat, always in the same place. For Mr. Collard, that will be the customs house, in a drawer labelled with innocent business. Search under invoices, late. Or, if you prefer a shorter errand, the neighbour's desk 2 doors down." Lestrade grunted. "We'll try both." They had scarcely gone when Mrs. Pike, white-faced and contrite, appeared in the doorway. "He asked if Mr. Geoffrey would be alone," she whispered. "I said you would be with him. I couldn't lie about that." "You told the precise truth we required," said Holmes with a nod. "There is one service more. Bring me, if you please, the little china dish in which you keep the desk key." She fetched it, and he poured into his palm the oddments it contained: a bead, a twist of thread, a brass screw, and a small, narrow-ended key unlike the rest. "Not mislaid, only missorted," he said, weighing it. "It will fit nothing now of consequence, but it proves a habit. Keys do not vanish in innocent houses. They migrate." The hall bell rang then with an urgent peal, and in came Inspector Mordaunt, river-cold and satisfied, with salt upon his coat and a grin beneath his moustache. "Briggs is snug, Mr. Holmes, and the Swallow's belly is turned out like a pocket. We have silk enough for a duchess's wardrobe, and papers enough to keep a magistrate through Sunday. One crate had a false bottom. Neat work." "Neatness is Mr. Collard's religion," Holmes observed. "It has betrayed him at last." Mordaunt's eye fell on the ledger upon the table. "Is that the book of which my sergeant spoke?" "It is the half which names enough names to fill your cutter," said Holmes. "The other half will be in the place we have indicated to Lestrade. When the 2 are married, you will see the full ceremony of payments: Howard to Briggs, Briggs to Collard, Collard to Elphinstone, and Elphinstone to silence." He looked past us to the window where the fog pressed like a listening ear. "But there remains the letter, the cruel little contrivance that walked to Geoffrey Markham's door on the day after his brother went under the ground. That, too, we shall set in its frame." "Have you the frame?" I asked. "I have the nail upon which to hang it," he answered. "Tomorrow, when Collard has spent a night of official hospitality, we shall pay our respects to St. Jude's churchyard and to the boy who carries letters from the Southwark office. If I am wrong, we will lose an hour. If I am right, we shall find that the bearer Charles Markham trusted was not a postman at all, but a living messenger who never arrived because a certain gentleman intercepted him at the gate. He closed the ledger and slipped the key from the china dish into his pocket. "Sleep, Watson. I will sit here for a while and listen to the house breathe. The spider is taken, but the web still trembles. There is one more pluck before it is still." The next morning broke with a pale, listless light, the fog not gone but thinned to a gauze that clung in the gutters and drifted above the roofs. Holmes was already at the table with coffee cooling in its cup, the ledger open beside him, and a small notebook in which he had been making a column of addresses and initials. He glanced up only long enough to remark that Lestrade had wired. Collard's second volume had been recovered in a locked drawer at the customs house, exactly where Holmes had predicted, the final entries carrying the conspiracy clean through to the eve of Charles Markham's death. "The web is complete," I said, sitting opposite him. "The threads are visible," he corrected, "but not yet taut. There is one gap, how the letter traveled. That message is the hinge upon which the killer's plan swung. Without understanding its passage, we cannot be sure we have every accomplice. A scheme of this intricacy rarely leaves so small an opening. It was meant to be a lever against Geoffrey Markham, to lure him where he could be dealt with as his brother had been." He closed the ledger and rose, taking up his coat. "To Southwark, Watson, and then to St. Jude's. We shall speak to a boy who may have delivered nothing at all." The Southwark sorting office was a low brick building. Its windows steamed from the warmth within. Holmes went straight to the supervisor, a man of lean habit and sharp eye, and presented his card. "We are concerned with a letter postmarked here on the morning of the 10th instes, addressed to Mr. Geoffrey Markham, Upper Norwood. I wish to know who handled it." The supervisor frowned. "That's irregular, Mr. Holmes." "It is also in the interest of the Yard," Holmes returned, and with a few precise questions he had narrowed the handling to a single morning shift and thence to one errand boy, a slight youth with a fringe of hair escaping from under his cap. The boy looked wary until Holmes drew from his pocket a sixpence and set it spinning upon the desk. "You delivered a number of letters that morning. Do you recall a man stopping you before you reached the Markham address?" "Yes, sir," the boy said after a moment. "I was just turning into the road when a gentleman comes up and says he's the housekeeper's brother, Mrs. Pike's, and he'll take any post for them, 'cause they're at the funeral still. Had the look of knowing her, so I gives him the letter." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Describe him." "Neat whiskers, grey, coat like an office man. Said his name was Collard." Holmes flipped the coin to him and we left. "So," he murmured as we stepped into the street, "the letter never touched the gate. Collard intercepted it at the very edge of its arrival, then took it upon himself to alter or replace the sheet inside before it ever reached Geoffrey Markham. The handwriting was Charles's, the paper his, but the line about trusting the bearer, that remained from its original purpose. Collard counted on the change of delivery method to distort its meaning. The postmark, of course, was genuine. He simply posted it himself after tampering with it. "And the purpose?" I asked. "To keep Geoffrey's trust in a bearer who would never come, thus buying them a day or two to remove the ledger and prepare his ruin. Had Geoffrey gone seeking that bearer in person, they might have staged a second apoplexy and closed the affair. His coming instead to Baker Street derailed them. From Southwark, we took a cab to St. Jude's, the churchyard lying still under the morning haze. The caretaker, a stooped man with a kindly, if cautious manner, remembered the burial plainly. "Not much family there, sir. Just Mr. Geoffrey and a neighbour to say the words." Doctor came after to sign papers, then went off with the neighbour in quiet talk. "Collard again," Holmes said under his breath. The caretaker nodded. "Yes, that's him. Customs house man. Stood by the grave a long while after the rest had gone, like he was thinking on something." Holmes bent to inspect the narrow path between the Markham plot and the side gate. The gravel was newly raked, but his keen gaze swept the stone edging where a faint scuff mark showed on the lower coping. He touched it with his finger and examined the dust clinging there. "Paper ash," he murmured. A fragment of a note burnt on the spot, too fragile to survive the journey elsewhere. Perhaps the original draft of that letter, destroyed once its content had been transferred and amended. Collard was nothing if not tidy. We walked back to the cab, Holmes silent, his long stride purposeful. "That settles the last uncertainty," he said at length. Collard controlled the flow from beginning to end. The ledger's concealment, its removal, and the letter that was meant to lure Geoffrey into their reach. Howard and Briggs were active partners, but without Collard's official position their trade would have collapsed. It is a fitting symmetry that it will be his own signature in the Customs House books, matching the marks in the ledger, which will secure his conviction. When we reached Baker Street, a note awaited us from Lestrade asking us to attend the yard for formal statements. Miss Howard, it seemed, had already begun to talk, under the strain of confinement, confirming much of what Holmes had pieced together. Briggs, on learning of her cooperation, had added his own admissions, none of them charitable toward his former accomplice at the Customs House. Dr. Elphinston still held out, but with both ledgers in police hands, his entries clearly recorded, even his obstinacy could only delay the inevitable. At the yard, Lestrade was in high spirits. "You've given me a clean sweep, Mr. Holmes. 2 ledgers, 3 confessions, and enough silk to stock a dozen Bond Street shops. And this letter business, devilishly neat. The Crown will make much of that in court." Holmes inclined his head. "It is a pleasing conclusion when the last piece drops neatly into place. But remember, Inspector, that it was Charles Markham's own suspicion and his care in writing to his brother that began the trail. We have merely followed it." On our return, as the lamps were being lit in the street, I asked Holmes if there remained any part of the affair that dissatisfied him. He smiled faintly. "Only that we cannot know whether Charles Markham meant his letter for Geoffrey's eyes alone, or whether he hoped its contents would pass to me. He had heard of me, I think. Such men in trade often do when matters grow delicate, but his death cut short the certainty. What we can say is that he was within a day of breaking with the others, and that this, rather than any sudden malice, sealed his fate." He took up the ledger once more, turning it so the lamplight fell across its pages. "Every column here is a thread in a pattern. Remove one and the design is marred. Pull enough and the whole collapses. That is true of crime as of cloth, Watson. Our task is simply to find the right thread to draw." The fire crackled in the grate. The fog thickened outside, and the case, like so many before it, had passed from the realm of peril into that of recollection. But in Holmes's eyes there was still that restless gleam, as though some other web, not yet spun, was already stirring in the darkness beyond Baker Street. The fog thickened again toward evening, laying a grey nap upon the window sashes and muffling the rattle of passing wheels. We had scarcely laid aside our coats when a note arrived from Lestrade. Collard, it said, had preserved an admirable reserve regarding the murder, but had proved less stoical upon the matter of the ledgers. He admitted the marks were his, and that he had winked at diversions, but he flung out that he was no poisoner, and that if Charles Markham had died before his time it was due to a medical mischance or a woman's folly. Holmes read that line twice, folded the paper with care, and placed it on the mantel as a man puts away a card he means to play later. "Observe the shuffle, Watson," he said. "He seeks to save the center of his web by loosing the outer threads. He offers us the woman and the doctor, hoping that between them the rope will fray. We shall oblige him by taking both ends at once. How? By asking 2 people to contradict their own pasts, the housekeeper with a heart and the physician without one." It was near to 7 when we returned to Upper Norwood. Mrs. Pike answered our ring with that particular stiffness, which is not hostility so much as the resolve not to be taken in a second time. Holmes's courtesy did not abate. "One question only," he said. "On the afternoon your master died, the lady who called, did she offer him anything in the way of refreshment that did not come from your kitchen?" Mrs. Pike, surprised, searched her memory. She had a little tin of pastilles, sir, violet-scented things. She took one for herself and set one upon the tray. I thought no harm. He did not like sweets. He set it aside and asked for tea. Holmes's eyes lit as a taper takes fire. Set it aside. Where? On the corner there, by the seal, she said, pointing to the desk. Holmes crossed to the spot. He knelt, held his lens aslant to the baize, and then, with a delicate touch, lifted from the fabric a minute, translucent scale that clung like a fish's fin. He brought it to the lamp. It gave back the faintest violet sheen. Horace used to scent cheap violet pastilles, he murmured. And something less innocent embedded with it, we shall see. From his pocket, he produced a tiny bottle and a folded paper of pale crystals. He moistened the scale with a drop, added a grain from the paper, and a breath of household ammonia from the stopper of a bottle upon the sideboard. The scent that rose was not violet now, but the bitter ghost of almonds. Hydrocyanic acid, he said very quietly. No trace for a hasty doctor at a tidy deathbed. No stain upon the lips when the morsel is handled, and the fingers, damp from tea steam, carry it unawares to the mouth. A touch is enough when the strength is properly compounded. Our Lady brought him the means. Our doctor secured the verdict. Mrs. Pike's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh, sir, courage," Holmes returned, with unexpected gentleness. "The worst has been done. We're only unmasking it." He stood very still for a moment, thinking. Then the steel returned to his voice. "Watson, we must have Dr. Elphinston here with his bag and his professional confidence. He will not come to us for conscience, but he will come for pride and for fear. Sit you down and write at my dictation." I took the pen, and he paced, dictating in a tone as cool as a surgeon's. A note in Geoffrey Markham's name. Lestrade having permitted him to quit the yard upon his promise to remain within call, requesting the doctor most urgently to come at once to the house, as Mrs. Pike had fallen in a faint with signs horribly like those of my late brother. God forbid it, and the police are not here. Holmes added a line with his own hand. "Bring the restorative you used last time." He sanded and sealed it. "Mrs. Pike," he said, "a boy will run this. You will say nothing of our presence. When the doctor comes, you will let him into the study and leave him to his work for 1 minute. At the end of that, cough twice in the passage. That is all." He sent the note by a street urchin whose loyalty he purchased with a shilling, and the promise of another if the errand were run faster than any he had ever run. Then he moved with his usual economy about the room, setting 2 chairs, adjusting the lamp so that the light fell full upon the desk and not at all upon the corner where we would stand, and laying out upon the tray the teacup and spoon left from that afternoon. He placed beside them, very precisely, the little ivory whistle and the tiny bottle from which he had performed his test. "You will be patient, Watson," he said in an undertone. "You will also be ready." The minutes drew out with that particular elastic torture which attends an ambush. We heard the front gate, Mrs. Pike's step, a brisk foot upon the passage. Elphinstone entered, the same spare figure, the same compressed nose bridge, the same careful cuffs. He carried his case and the air of a man who wishes to be paid before he has taken off his gloves. "Where is the woman?" he demanded. "In here," Mrs. Pike said, and melted away at Holmes's look. Elphinstone set down his case and pinched his nostrils as if to clear his head for professional duty. He glanced about the room once, and in that glance I saw something go taut within him. He should have found a swooning servant. Instead, he found a desk, a teacup, and the same quiet stage upon which he had played before. He opened his case. Its contents were scrupulously arranged: bandage, lancet, a vial of sal volatile, another of ether, a third in brown glass without label. His hand hovered a fraction too long over the last. He recovered, uncorked the sal volatile, and waved it as if to illustrate an intended course of action. Holmes spoke from the shadow. "Do not trouble yourself to simulate, Doctor. The patient you expect is your own conscience." Elphinstone started, and the bottle of sal volatile clicked against the rim of the tray. He turned. Holmes stepped into the light with that dreadful gentleness which is his most relentless form of attack. "You will oblige me," Holmes said, "by setting your case upon the desk and removing the brown bottle to the right-hand side. Then, with your left hand, you will undo your cuff and show me the inside of your wrist." Elphinstone's mouth thinned. "I will do nothing of the kind." "You will," Holmes said, and the tone would have moved a bull terrier from a bone. "Because your cuff bears, at the inner edge, a faint bloom of violet powder, caught there when you leaned to the tray 2 days ago to test whether a pastille had been swallowed. And because the inside of your wrist will show if you have not washed like Pilot, the pinpoint where you pricked yourself yesterday afternoon with the same compound to reassure some last scruple that your dose was clinical and not lethal. You came to your senses while the clerk burned, Doctor. That was prudent. It was not enough." The man's eyes had grown black and bright. A pulse leapt at his temple. He looked at the door. Holmes did not move, but something in his stillness made the corridor a mile away. Elphinstone flung back his cuff with a sudden, almost theatrical motion. The skin within showed a tiny, angry dot. "A wasp," he said, and the lie was as pale as the skin upon which he hung it. Holmes did not even trouble himself to contradict. He lifted the brown bottle, removed the cork, and waved it an inch from his own nostrils. He did not inhale. He watched instead as the air above the mouth trembled and then grew still. "Laurel water," he said. "Strong, and masked in the preparation by Orris. You are a precise man, Doctor. Elphinstone. You would not trust to a lady's confection alone. You ensured what she intended by adding a drop under the tongue while you bent in professional sympathy. No convulsion, no stain that a cloth could not remove, and a verdict as neat as your ledger entries." The colour left Elphinstone's face like ink draining from a pen. "You cannot prove—" "At trial," Holmes returned. "But here, in this room, I do not try. I show." "Watson." He had already placed upon the tray a porcelain watch-glass, a strip of iron salt paper, and a minute quantity of the reagent he had used upon the pastille scale. He let fall the merest smear from the bottle's lip upon the watch-glass, added his grain and the breath of ammonia once more. The bitter almond stole out unmistakable. He touched the moistened strip to the smeared rim of the teacup. It darkened to that peculiar tint which my hospital days taught me to recognize in tests for hydrocyanic residues. Elphinstone sat down. It was not surrender. It was the body-saving face for the mind that had nowhere left to go. Holmes's voice softened. "You are not a born criminal, Doctor. You are a man who allowed a tidy arrangement to become a habit and a habit to become a dependence. Collard needed a verdict. Briggs needed time. The lady wanted her hands cleaner than her skirts. They told you it would be swift, professional, unseen. They were right about 2 of the 3. The cough sounded in the passage, the agreed signal, and Lestrade came in with that brisk, official tread that makes guilt sound like a clock striking. He took it all in at a glance, the bottle, the strip, the man. "I shall require the exact composition of your restorative, Doctor," he said with a cheerfulness that was more business than malice. "You can tell me at the station or here." Elphinstone's mouth opened and shut. Then his hand moved, not to flee, not to fight, but to the brown bottle, which he pushed with a shudder of fastidious disgust to the very edge of the desk as if to rid himself of it without touching it any more than he must. "Do not let him handle it," Holmes said quietly. Lestrade's man bagged it with care. "There remains only one little courtesan of chance," Holmes added, "and we will go to her shrine now." "Where's that?" Lestrade asked. "The chemist who sold this gentleman his Orris," said Holmes. When one scents laurel water, one needs a mask. There are 2 chemists within a half-mile who keep both, and one of them is fond of his accounts. If our doctor's name does not appear, it will be set down to Howard or to a lady, which in a ledger is as good as a confession. Elphinstone rose with a rigidity that was not dignity so much as the last form the body knows when it would fall and will not. Lestrade took him. The door closed. The house gave the smallest sigh, as a place does when a pressure that has sat upon it lifts. Holmes stood a moment with his hand upon the back of the chair. Then he put the watch-glass and strip away and turned to the mantel. He took down Lestrade's note and tapped it with a fingertip. "He offered us a woman's folly or a medical mischance," he murmured. "We have given him both with names." When Geoffrey Markham came at last, white but erect, Holmes met him at the study door and did not bring him in. "Your brother wrote to save you," he said. "He failed to save himself. The men who profited by his death will not profit by yours. If you wish to thank any person, thank him and the river, which is patient and remembers what passes across it." Markham gripped Holmes's hand as though to anchor himself to something that would neither sink nor drift, and then hurried away to write the first of many letters a man must write when the dead leave their affairs in hands not yet steady. We walked back toward Baker Street under a sky that had not decided between drizzle and clear. Holmes did not smoke. His eyes were turned inward. At the corner by the gate of St. Jude's, the lamplighter's flame jumped upon his features and showed, for an instant, not triumph but a grave fatigue. "You are not satisfied?" I asked. "I am," he said. And then, after a moment, "I am as far as the world requires. But my own scales are more capricious. I do not often pity the spider, Watson. Tonight I pity the fly." "The fly?" I echoed. "Charles Markham," he said. "He came late to a crooked table and tried to leave it. He paid the price set by those who had eaten there longer. That is not justice. It is only arithmetic. We have adjusted the sum. Tomorrow we shall show our working." The following morning, Baker Street was uncommonly quiet, save for the faint hiss of the kettle and the turning of newspaper sheets. Lestrade had been and gone before breakfast, his satisfaction obvious even in the brevity of his visit. The confessions were signed, the ledgers complete, the Crown's case unassailable. The Swallow's cargo had been inventoried, the silk returned to its rightful owners, and the contraband entries in the Customs House logbook matched to the initials in the 2 books Holmes had recovered. Holmes, seated at his desk with his long fingers steepled, regarded the morning's telegrams as a chess player might survey a board after the checkmate. It is an elegant conclusion, Watson. Each player took their own role with commendable, if criminal, precision. Miss Howard brokered the goods. Briggs moved them under cover of his lighter. Collard's official seal cleared their passage, and Dr. Elphinstone provided a verdict whenever inconvenient mortality arose. But Charles Markham's resolve to break with them, too late though it proved, shifted the balance. I set aside my coffee. And his letter, altered though it was, brought Geoffrey here instead of to his death. "Exactly," Holmes said. "The irony, Watson, is that Collard's cleverness in altering the delivery preserved the very clue that undid him. The postmark was genuine, but the manner of delivery contradicted the phrase, 'Trust the bearer.' That inconsistency was the grain of sand in the clockwork." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Once we traced the letter's path, the rest fell into place. Collard intercepted it, tampered with the contents, and posted it himself. Meanwhile, Miss Howard removed the ledger, Briggs prepared the shipment, and Elphinstone stood ready to make an apoplexy of any who threatened the scheme. Each believed themselves indispensable. Each was betrayed by the other's greed. I could not help remarking on his precision in dismantling the plot. "And yet," I said, "you told me last night that you pitied the fly." Holmes's gaze drifted to the window, where the fog was breaking to reveal a pale wash of sunlight. "I do. Charles Markham had eaten from a tainted table. Yes, but when at last he chose to stand, he did so in the knowledge that he was endangering himself. His warning was clumsy, and fate saw to it that it was intercepted, but it was a warning nonetheless. That choice, Watson, separates him from the rest. There was a tap at the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted Geoffrey Markham. He looked better than when we had last seen him, though his expression was still shadowed. In his hand, he held a sealed envelope. "I've just come from St. Jude's," he said quietly. "I wanted to place this in your keeping. It's my brother's handwriting, a note I found tucked in the lining of his desk, missed when they took the ledger. I think it was meant for me." Holmes broke the seal with care. The single page inside bore only a few lines. "If I fail, trust the one who knows the whole before the end. He will read this without my speaking it." Holmes folded the note and placed it in the drawer of his desk. "Your brother was a shrewd judge of character," he said. "He left you in better hands than he knew. Go home, Mr. Markham, and see to your affairs. The shadow over your house has lifted." When our visitor had gone, Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. The blue smoke curled upward, diffusing into the last of the morning mist. "Another web broken," I observed. Holmes gave a wry smile. "There will always be another, Watson. The city breeds them as the river breeds its tides. But for the moment," he stretched his legs toward the fire, "I am content to let the strands lie." And with that, he reached for the violin, drawing from it a low, contemplative phrase that lingered in the room long after the bow had left the strings, as if the case itself, now settled, had left its own echo in the air. "Don't echo in the air. Don't 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 echo in the air.